Let's talk about some export options here. If I have all these pieces and I select them all by using Command A, Control A on a PC, I now have 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces. Well, wait a minute. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's this many pieces in the timeline, but there are more instances in the timeline of the same object. I can't send my client this one, this one, this one, and this one because my client will just get 4 files that don't have any timeline, timestamp, order, volume, anything connecting them. So what I need to do is to put all these pieces together. And if you were looking for, in the menus, something called digital mixdown, you might be looking a long time because Pro Tools doesn't call it that. It calls it by the rather odd title of Consolidate. Consolidate means take these individual clips and glue them together and make a new audio file, which is basically what I would call digital mixdown, but it's called Consolidate. And it will turn your clips into one clip. Remember earlier we talked about parents and children? Well, we had only one parent up here and a bunch of children, and now our children have become a parent. Those 4 clips have glued together now. And I can double click on this and call this 4 o'clock. Do I want to name the clip or name the clip and the disk file? You always want the name of the clip and the disk file to be the same. The alternative would be calling it something here and calling it something different in your file hierarchy. I don't see any reason why you'd ever want to do that. So we'll say OK. And now instead of my client getting a file called chime-01, he will get a file called 4 o'clock. Now how will he get that file? We'll click here and choose Export Clips as Files. If this is grayed out, it's because your clip is not selected. If I unselect that clip, that goes away. So just be sure that Pro Tools knows what you want to export as files. Define a clip, and then say Export as Files. And you have options here, much like the ones we did when we created our session and we had session parameters. So we can choose file types. Then you have a choice for interleaved, which is gluing the left and the right together as a typical stereo file, or multiple mono. Why would you ever want to use multiple mono? Well, when you're sending this to a colleague who's going to work in Pro Tools will take the stereo file and chop it up into an L and an R. We saw that over here on every single one of these. Any triangle we open here will have a .L and a .R in it. So it saves a step if we do multiple mono. It's a Pro Tools thing. In our case, we're sending this to a client, so we want to send them 1 file, not 2 files. The bit depth and sample rate will be determined ahead of time by your client's needs. If you're working in a game, it's going to be one format. For broadcast, it's going to be something different. There are lots of choices here. Be sure that you confer with your client and agree on a format ahead of time. And then you have a choice for where to save it. It will automatically save it to the session folder and the audio files folder inside that session folder of the session you're in. That's its default. If you want to send it somewhere else, hit choose and select a new place. These hardly ever come into play, but it does give you a way to resolve duplicate file names. Now you have another option here. Let me cancel out of that. You can bounce this file, bounce to disk. Let me move this out of the way. Gives you a lot of the same options here. It's going to pull the output from the one you're listening to. It's going to let you choose the session file type. You can add an MP3 and do that simultaneously, and that's new in Pro Tools 11. Then you have your same choices here. You can add this back to your iTunes library, or you can share it with SoundCloud or Gobbler, so publish it right out of Pro Tools. You get to name the file name differently now if you want to, and this tells you where it's going to send it. The default here is a different file. It's not in the audio files folder, it's in the bounced files folder of that session file. So new in Pro Tools 11 is offline bouncing. If you don't choose offline bouncing, a bounce will take as long as the file is. Let's just do this, and it's going to take 40-something seconds to do this. Well, I told you early on that Pro Tools would probably misbehave at some point. And here it is. It's telling me that it can't get the data from the drive fast enough. All I'm asking it really to do is to play a file and record a new file. And Pro Tools is unhappy with me. It's really not a very complicated process. I will attempt to figure out why it crashed on me, and I will say OK at the moment. I think I'm going to try it again and see if it misbehaves. Let's see, is this all correct? Yeah, I'll take it. Now, I killed that one. I killed it with Command period because I didn't want it to take all 47 seconds. So it worked the second time. It got a momentary disk error and gave me that pop-up. In the first pop-up, it said, you should probably stop and defragment your drive and so forth. And, I've been around Pro Tools long enough to know that I think it was kidding. Sometimes it's worth giving it a second shot. In my case, it worked just fine. So a bounce is as long as you tell it to be. I told it to be 46 seconds. It contains anything you can hear. So in this case, it's this one little track of clock. So what's the advantage of bouncing versus exporting? You have to bounce when you have more than one track. If you have piano, bass, drums, guitars, vocals, strings, horns, percussion, you have to bounce. You can't export. If you export, you're going to wind up with lots of disconnected files. There's one scenario where we want lots of disconnected files, and that's when we're making stems of our music, but that's not the case here. When we're trying to combine all the sounds into one file, which is typical of a mix, a bounce is as long as you tell it to be and will contain whatever you can hear. Exporting is faster, and it works great if you just have one file that you want to send out. So that's our project. We said we were going to import a file, chop it up, rearrange it, and export it. And it's a simple exercise, but that's a lot of what we do in Pro Tools. So that was good practice. We learned a couple tools, we learned a couple of the editing modes, and we learned some options for bouncing and exporting.